Hi everyone, welcome to the Earth Science Regents Review podcast series created by Hummock's Middle School Earth Science Department. Today we're going to focus our attention on landscapes and the shape of the surface of the Earth. Now we determine the shape of the Earth, or really the surface of the Earth, by what we call the topography. Topography just means the shape of the land. Now the shape of the land is going to solely be based upon the elevation of a specific landscape. Now we have three basic landscapes. We have plains, plateaus, and mountains. Now they're all categorized solely really by the relief, the difference in elevation. Plains have the lowest relief, plateaus have middle relief, and mountains have the highest. Really all relief is the difference between highest and lowest elevation of a specific landscape. So, some of the factors are going to include elevation or relief, the type of rock that's under the soil, and also the way that water drains off of the surface. So, plains regions have the lowest relief. They're going to be made up of sedimentary rock that is relatively flat and horizontal. Not a whole lot going on with your plains areas. The next type of landscape is a plateau. Plateaus are very similar to plains in the sense that they're made up of the same type of rock, but you're going to have a little bit more relief. The structure tends to be a little bit more elevated, even though it's relatively flat, horizontal sedimentary rock as well. There's the Colorado Plateau. Now, speaking of plateaus, the Catskill Mountains are actually part of a plateau region, specifically what we call the dissected plateau region of the Allegheny Plateau. Well, what do we mean by dissected plateau? Water tends to cut its way through the rock to give the illusion of having rolling hills or rolling mountains. So when we talk about the Catskills as mountains, they're really not true mountains. And here's the reason why. The Adirondacks and the Catskills are made up of very different type of rock. Catskills are sedimentary, Adirondacks are metamorphic. So even though they look very similar in nature, the Catskills are sedimentary, relatively flat horizontal structure. Metamorphic rock is your true mountain range. Speaking of mountains, mountains are going to have the highest relief, they're going to have the steepest slope, the greatest elevation, and your metamorphic rock with possibly even some deformed structure, such as folding, faulting, or tilting of rock. Now, there is one major factor that does influence landscape, and that's climate, specifically temperature and moisture. They're going to tell you whether or not you have an arid landscape or a humid landscape. Let me show you the difference between them. An arid landscape is basically going to have very little moisture, steep slopes, angled rock, no vegetation, with very thin soils. So you're predominantly going to get a lot of physical weathering here because of the lack of moisture. Your humid climates, on the other hand, are very moist. They have very gentle slopes, rounded rocks, lots of vegetation, really thick soils, and you tend to get a lot of chemical weathering with your humid climates. Now, just to kind of show you just a couple of regions diagrams, there's a humid climate with the rounded structure and the arid climate with the very angled structure. So you see the big difference between the two of them. So climate's going to have a major factor on your landscape, but so are your drainage patterns as well. So basically, we want to try to figure out the way that water is going to flow off the landscape. Now, mountains, plateaus, and plains all have different ways in which water flows off, very simply because of the rock type and the elevation difference. So your bedrock structure is very important here, and also your elevation difference. So you have four basic types of drainage patterns: dendritic, trellis, annular, and radial. Let me show you the difference between them. The first one is what we call radial, and this is going to be found mostly in mountain ranges and areas with big hillsides, in which water is going to flow off the slope in all different directions. Basically, water is going to hit a central peak or a central point on a hill or a mountain, and it's going to flow out. It's going to radiate from one distinct location. Now, when you look at these drainage patterns, they kind of make sense with the landscape. They look like they'll fit with the landscape. The next one is what we call dendritic or branching. This occurs in really flat areas, and water tends to branch off in many directions. So you see the landscape of being very flat, maybe a plain area, and then the dendritic or the branching, you see where it gets its name from. The next one is what we call trellis or rectangular. A lot of times water is going to flow in a somewhat of a geometric shape here. Water is going to flow off a plateau region. In many cases, the plateaus might have faulted rock or folded rock underneath the soil. So what will happen here is that the water will flow through the trough regions of, say, the folds here. So you'll see that the trellis pattern here looks like it fits into that landscape. It will follow the real low areas of those folds. Then finally, you'll have an annular pattern. And an annular pattern, very simply, happens in areas where igneous material actually breaks through the sedimentary rock. So what happens here is that sedimentary rock gets eroded away, leaves nice grooves in the rock, so the water is going to flow through the grooves in the rock. So you can see that the annular pattern looks like it will actually fit in those circular grooves within the rock there. So that's pretty much it with the drainage patterns. The last part I want to talk about is what we call a drainage basin and a watershed. Basically, a drainage basin is just basically the water that's going to drain into an area. Usually with the drainage basin, you'll actually have a major body of water that the water drains into. So here in southern Westchester, some of the major drainage basin is going to be the Hudson River and maybe the Atlantic Ocean or the Long Island Sound. The watershed is basically all the water in the area that drains into the drainage basin. And many times you'll get what are called tributary streams. They feed a watershed. So for instance, you might have the Mohawk River feeds into the Hudson River. The Mohawk River is a tributary of the Hudson River itself. Here's a Regents diagram of the Mississippi drainage basin, and you see the Missouri, the Arkansas, and the Ohio River all feed into the muddy Mississippi, which eventually drains into the Gulf of Mexico. So that's pretty much it with landscapes. We'll talk to you soon.